Greetings all, Dr. Garrett here along with Dr. Harbison. And as you can see, I'm literally and figuratively in the workshop today. And we're going to be continuing that theme by breaking down and looking at a movement that has quite a bit of controversy around it, and that is the deadlift. Now, there's many different reasons for executing this exercise. So we're going to go through the purpose, some variations, common faults, as well as how to progress someone through and kind of give the life cycle of a deadlift. So something that's very valuable to me, and the main purpose for the deadlift for me is developing posterior strength. And by posterior strength, what we're talking about is our back, our glutes, our hamstrings. And so this movement is one of the best ways to overload the posterior chain. Dr. Harbison, what are some valuable takeaways for you with this exercise?
Yeah, I would agree. As far as posterior chain, we'll talk about the applications of that as far as athletically, as far as general population as well. But I think one of the things I think of in addition to that, for me, I know that when I'm not deadlifting or not practicing that movement enough or at all, I get sloppy with my lifting mechanics, just picking stuff up around the house. You and I both have kids, or I have a kid, and picking up toys around the floor and things like that. If I'm not practicing this movement in the gym, or just kind of in a mechanical sense, it's easy to lose track of, or at least get lazy with those lifting mechanics, just reaching down to pick something off the floor. Versus when I am practicing it and kind of on top of things, minding my P's and Q's in the weight room, I'm very much more locked in. Like anytime I bend over, it's like just kind of an instinctual type of thing, where you're loading that posterior chain, getting some of the hamstring and glute and low back involvement in a correct way, even when you're picking up, a kid's toy versus just being sloppy with it. So, I think there's a ton of application for strength and kind of that power type development.
Mm-hmm.
But it's great for just general lifting mechanics as well, which is a movement that we do every single day, no matter who you are or where you are. We pick stuff up off the ground all the time. So it's an important one for that kind of functional aspect as well.
So you'd say it's a great way to make yourself aware, give yourself a little bit of kinesthetic awareness, perhaps, and just generally develop posterior strength, as we mentioned, but also stability and kind of posture, or addressing posture, I guess would be a better maybe example or discussion for that. And then one other thing too is it's great for general hip extension. So for, athletic transfer, jumping in particular, where the hips are violently extending, pushing, rather pulling, where we may be having to extend the hips as we pull the weight towards us. And then also what's interesting, and I was thinking about this, is it's actually a very safe movement to me. And the reason why, it's probably the easiest one to dump the weight. So if it gets too heavy, just let go. And so when I think about this, because, a squat, you can make an argument for a squat training the posterior chain as well. And when I think about a squat, you're buried underneath that bar. And so to dodge or dump the bar during a squat, it's kind of scary. So the deadlift is a lot easier from that perspective. But the reasons why it's unsafe, and maybe we'll go into some of the errors, or maybe we'll do variations first, but we'll get into some of the reasons why it's unsafe and why it has the kind of negative connotation to it when we get there. But in general, I would argue that it's also safe because we could just drop the bar. It's in front of us.
Yeah, that's a good point. It's interesting. I wouldn't have thought to bring that up, but it's a good point that you don't really need a spotter on deadlift because you just drop the weight. So
right.
Yeah.
So then we'll get into errors. Let's start with our kind of template that we have here. Let's go into some of the variations. What are some ways that you like to execute this movement, in addition to just a standard deadlift, right? That's what we see here, is just a bar with weight, and that's the standard there. So what are some other variations that you like to use?
I've always enjoyed, one of my favorites actually. So when I was training the deadlift pretty hard, one of my favorites to do was RDLs with bands. So revert or Romanian deadlift with bands. So like a band attachment on both sides of the barbell sleeve, just anchored to some weights down on the ground, or like you see here in this video, like a band attachment like that on the platform. I didn't have access to those back in the day, so you just tie bands around a dumbbell or something like that. But that was one of my favorites for really kind of isolating the hamstrings and low back and glutes as well. in a loaded fashion was kind of more of a, taking the knee extension component out of it and just focusing on the hip extension component. I really enjoyed those. I've never, well, I should say deficit deadlifts I think are really tough, and they're good in that sense. I was certainly one that had trouble, like when I failed on a deadlift, it was off the ground. You look at some people who maybe typically more advanced lifters, they'll fail midway or at the lockout component. For me, it was off the ground. So a deficit deadlift would be a perfect application for how to solve that problem and get better off the ground. I found, at least for me and my anatomy, I found it was really tough to maintain, let's say, neutral spine or correct posture, even with a couple inches of a deficit. And so I didn't really, plus they're just brutally hard. I never really got into deficits that much, but I recognize their value, especially if you're competing in powerlifting, or deadlift is your sport essentially. There's a lot of value there. Rack pulls, I worked a little bit on rack pulls. They're fun just because it's a shortened version. You're kind of working on the top half. But again, for me, that was never the problem. So it was more fun to do that.
Mm-hmm.
But I always really enjoyed the RDLs with bands. That was probably my favorite kind of supplemental or accessory movement for the deadlift.
Mm-hmm.
How about you?
Yeah. So those are kind of the same thing for me. Other things that I think about are the grip variations in that sense, where you may have like a mixed grip. And one of the things I would recommend there is if you do 5 reps with your right hand pronated and your left hand supinated, next set, just switch that up. Just making sure that we're keeping some balance there. That's not necessarily a variation in perhaps the difficulty, but a lot of folks will use that once the weight gets heavier, rather than using straps.
Did you lift with a mixed grip, or how do you pull?
I was always a pronated guy. Like yeah. And just, I always felt like if my grip was the limiting factor, then I need to strengthen my grip. And the way I'm going to strengthen my grip was through kind of doing it that way. I've used straps in the past, but not a ton. Most of this, anytime I used gear, I would find that it was early on, because I'm that guy that likes the gimmick. I like the knee wraps. I like the lifting shoes. I like the belts, the wrap. I have all those things, but the more I train, the less I use it. And also part of that goes into the functionality of it, right? Like I'm not going for a 1RM deadlift every week where straps would be great, because then my grip isn't the limiting strength and I can overload my legs or truly test my leg strength at that point.
Yeah. For anyone who might not be familiar with the different types of grips, why don't we discuss that real quick?
Yeah. So for me, there's just your pronated grip, but then you can also mix grip. And kind of the idea here is that when you start to lose your grip, your hands almost start to come out this way and the bar just rolls right out. But if you have kind of this counter or contralateral, if that would be counter, for sure, grip, then as this rolls out, it kind of is like throwing it into the palm of your other hand. At least that's what it feels like for me.
Yeah. And so then the potential danger with that would be if you don't change. So if you're always a right hand over, left hand under, and you never switch it up, the potential danger is whatever hand is supinated, the bicep on that side is going to be overloaded, and then kind of more like the traps on the pronated side are going to be overloaded. So if you don't switch, you could have some muscular imbalances.
Right.
And then hook grip would be kind of, if you have a bar here, it'd be like, wrapping your thumb underneath and then wrapping your fingers around your thumb to kind of squeeze your thumb in between your hand and the bar. And it's painful the first couple times you do it, and then you get used to it. And
and it's like, it's
really well.
It's like riding a bike. It just it's like a broken in glove. It just feels right.
I think one of the benefits with that, then the reason I switched to that is because I didn't want to have to keep alternating a mixed grip. It's like if I can just keep that same grip the whole time, and I never ran into a problem where grip strength was a limiting factor for me, at least. It was always trunk.
Which we'll get into with the errors. But some other variations are using a trap bar where it's almost like this multi-angled bar. For me, I felt like I was squatting more whenever I use a trap bar, which, there's some application to that, but to me, at the core, the deadlift is a true posterior dominant exercise. Whereas when you throw the trap bar in there, there's some room for a little bit more quad dominance, perhaps. And if you don't have the mechanics of the posterior dominant movement pattern, then you're not going to train it the same. And if that's the point of the movement, then, there
I
you go.
agree.
Like,
Yeah,
I
exactly.
would argue that there are better workarounds for people that, the deadlift is one of those things where you get a guy that's 6'8" and is all legs. Well, man, that's tough. Well, this guy right here is 6'8", and we'll see that his mechanics are great, but he's also well proportioned too, not just mass, but like his trunk, his legs, and so on. And there's people that are literally made to deadlift. They have legs that are this tall and their torsos are this long, and they're,
Yep.
it's like a guy that bench presses with short arms. It's just,
Right. Yeah, anatomical differences definitely make a difference here. So you talk about like femur length,
mm-hmm.
short femurs, a long torso, and long arms mean you're going to do great at deadlifting because
Right.
you can get your hips higher at your starting point if you've got long arms.
Mm-hmm.
It gives you a mechanical advantage from which to start. Whereas if you have the long femur, like I think of like I've seen a lot of basketball players deadlift.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of taller, kind of just in the opposite. So obviously, there's we'll get to this video here of Hafthor Bjornsson deadlifting. Like you said, he's 6'8". But you look at a lot of other 6'8" guys who typically have long legs,
mm-hmm.
and the knees are jutting out over the bar. It's like, man, good luck.
Yeah.
It's gonna be
You're kind of crossing fingers and
yeah.
hoping something doesn't snap. And so variations for that is doing deadlifts off of blocks or doing the rack pulls like you're talking about. Or, there's no reason, there's no rule to lifting, in my opinion, that says it's not a deadlift unless it's off the ground with a 45-pound plate that's exactly 13 inches off the ground. Like, that's
unless you're competing in powerlifting or CrossFit or whatever. If it's your sport, right, sure, there's rules. Otherwise, I think as one of the things that we always want to highlight is rule number one of any strength and conditioning program better be do no harm.
Right.
And that's always, if the competition is taking place outside the weight room, whatever you're doing in the weight room better not injure your athletes or mess them up so that they can't perform. The idea is make them better so that they can take that to the field, or make them better on the field with whatever you're doing in the weight room. And so, like you said, if that means your athlete can't deadlift off the floor, you need to add a couple plates underneath or blocks or whatever it is, start there. That doesn't, it's not a cardinal sin necessarily. Like the first rule is always, let's make sure that they're safe and we're not doing harm.
So you mentioned cardinal rule, and I think let's maybe discuss quickly, perhaps like setup or general rules or kind of big picture things that we follow. And then we can get into some of these videos to talk about the errors. But for me, when I teach the deadlift, to keep it as simple as possible, especially when you're dealing with a range of folks, whether they're athletes or general population, sometimes athletes move worse than general population folks because they've just ingrained poor mechanics, or their anatomy is way different, or they're just new to it. And so they're kind of like Bambi trying to figure out how to do this thing. But for me in general, when I'm looking for a deadlift, I'm looking for a vertical shin, I'm looking for a neutral spine, and I'm looking for the armpits to generally be over the bar, particularly in the setup. The height of the hip is going to vary based on the anatomy of the individual. But in general, if we're keeping a neutral spine, our armpits are over the bar, and we have a vertical shin, we're going to at least be setting ourselves up for the most success possible, in my experience.
Yeah, no disagreement there. I think with anytime you're putting the spine under load, neutral spine is just of utmost importance. So you only have one spine. It's if you look at it anatomically, you talk about segment on top of segment on top of it. Like, this is a structure that's going to have a lot of potential weak points, and building stability and the ability to kind of lock that down so it's not flexing and bending in weird ways is really important. So I'm curious, how do you teach neutral spine? Just let me get your coaches, put your coach's hat on and tell me, how do you teach neutral spine for someone who's maybe new to a deadlift?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I've tried all of it, from putting a PVC pipe on the back to saying, hey, straighten your back. And so there's a couple things. The first one is the types of cueing. And this is something I learned over at Power Athlete, where there's a mechanical, emotional, and tactile cues that we can give people. Mechanical would be neutral spine, keep your spine straight. Emotional would be pretend like you're hinging at your hip and you have a PVC, or pretend like you have a rod coming out of your head and out of your glutes and you want a straight line coming out. You're giving them something that they can relate to. Whereas mechanical is very straightforward. Emotional is connecting with the individual, and then tactile is getting in their way. So that's where you would put a PVC on the back, or you would provide resistance. So if their back's rounding and you say, hey, if you touch my hand, you've gone out of a neutral spine. So those are the three kind of methods to try. And then actual execution for me, oddly enough, again, from Power Athlete, is getting folks into a dead bug for them to understand what a neutral spine is. So a dead bug for me is something that requires this neutral spine. You're laying on the ground, and so you can kind of feel what that posture is. And you're also developing strength through the midsection to hold that position, which will then transfer to the lift itself.
So for people who don't know what that is, so you're laying, supine.
You're laying supine. Your hips are, your ankles are dorsiflexed. Your knees are extended. Your hips are flexed at 90 degrees. So you're kind of like in this dead bug position, right? Your hands are in this more or less Frankenstein position, and shoulders are flexed at 90 degrees, just like your hips. And this means we need to go through it here. But that's just a good warm up to begin to fire and engage musculature, as well as reinforce quality patterning and posture. Mm-hmm. What about you?
So yeah, like you kind of, there's a ton of different ways to do it. I think as far as I like to try and keep it as simple as possible. And I think one of the ways, at least for me, one of the things that's made a lot of sense, and when I've tried to coach other people, this has seemed to work well. I stole this from Kelly Starrett, but basically the idea of looking at the pelvis and then the rib cage as almost like two cans of water, or buckets, two buckets of water. So if you're in neutral spine, your buckets are both underneath each other, and nothing's tipped one way or the other. As soon as you start getting, like, let's say, anterior tilt of the pelvis, posterior tilt of the thoracic spine, or the other, anytime those buckets start spilling water in opposite directions, you've lost neutral spine. So for example, in the deadlift, a lot of times, obviously the main error we want to avoid is spinal flexion, which would be kind of, this type of look. But on the other end of the spectrum, a lot of times you also see people who are hyperextended at the spine, and that's also a weak position. So it's finding that I think it's important to start out of a loaded position. So start in a position where you can find a neutral spine before you throw load on that. I think, kind of going back to the question I asked you, as far as when you're coaching someone who's new to the deadlift, 9 times out of 10, I'm not going to actually have them deadlift a bar with any weight on it yet, right? Because they need to learn the mechanics and kind of the kinesthetic education of, well, what does this actually feel like as I go through the planes of motion, or the movement itself, before there's any load on there. As we'll see with some of our erroneous videos here.
Yeah.
There's a lot of danger out there. Yeah, go ahead.
One thing that I also have found success in is starting actually with the eccentric phase. So getting people used to, because essentially you're just reversing, right, the movement. And so rather than starting from this hinged position, I'll have people start from a standing position. It's more familiar, it's comfortable. You can get their spine organized with the bucket method, or making sure the hips are under the rib cage, and then sending the hips back and getting the timing of the hip and knee flexion on the way down. Because that's I think an often overlooked piece too, where people they'll stand up straight, and then they'll bend their knees too quickly, and then they're working around their knees. So ideally the movement should look the same, whether you're going up or down, just in reverse. But a lot of people will push the knees out and start to work around the knees. That's causing a rounded back on the way down, right, even if on their ascent their spine was neutral. So that's another way that you can do that as well.
Yeah. Yeah. As far as, when you're actually coaching and cueing the deadlift, from a lateral view, I think is probably the most common way I'll approach it. And what you're talking about, kind of looking for a vertical bar path. Yeah. If like going back to our example of the 6'8" basketball player with really long femurs, his knees are kind of like typically the shins, so that the bar's here, his torso's up here. And if the knees are inclined too far forward, hips are too low, basically the bar has to travel around the knees before it goes up. Whereas if you have more of a vertical shin, as soon as you begin to pull, the bar can then go straight up. That's exactly what we're looking for there. So see some examples on video here.
Yeah, and I mean, we could talk about this all day long, but understand that there's a difference between a vertical shin and not having any. A vertical shin doesn't mean that there's no flexion at the knee. So you can have a vertical shin, and your knees be flexed past 90 degrees. Now, that's going to be real challenging, but a vertical shin, for me, helps make sure that I'm sending the weight into my hamstrings rather than allowing the knees to come forward and putting it more in my quads. So you can have a vertical shin with a lot of knee flexion. We're not saying don't bend at the knee at all. It just means your shin should be vertical, and then your knee can bend anywhere from there.
Mm-hmm. I think that goes back to one of the points you mentioned as far as the armpit over the bar. Again, if you're looking from a lateral view, if the armpits, that's a common error, would be the shoulders or the armpits being too far out in front of the bar, the weight then being on the toes, puts you in a poor position to pull. You think of, I don't know if you've heard this, but I've always heard some of the powerlifter guys talk about the idea of a teeter or a seesaw. Like you're trying to get as much of you behind the bars to kind of let gravity essentially pull, lever the bar off the ground. Now it doesn't actually work that way, but the idea or the cue being, don't get out over your toes, because then you're kind of screwed.
Well, if you're out over your toes, that means that the knees are now extended and the hips haven't extended. So your timing's off, and we'll see some of that here. So let's jump into these to get some visual examples here.
Let's see.
Whoa, that looks great.
Let me move us around. So one of the things I'll point out here with this first video, as we watch this gentleman lift here, is, and we didn't really touch on this necessarily, but the distance of the bar away from the shin. Again, when we talk about mechanical advantage or disadvantage here, and kind of that seesaw effect, the closer the bar gets to your center of gravity or center of mass, let's say, the more mechanically advantageous it is for you. The further it gets away, you're lengthening the lever at your spine, the lower back, and making it a more difficult lift. So we'll watch this guy. This is one of the errors that I see here, is the bar just never even gets to the shin. Obviously, the spinal mechanics are heinous as well.
Go ahead and, if you can, try to pause like right at, so this is about his setup. The feet width look okay, like, right? We're looking for the feet to be about hip width apart, because if they go too wide, then the knees are going to run into the arms. So feet are about underneath the hip. The shins are not too bad as far as being vertical, but like you said, the bar is just almost out past his toes to start with. And then of course we see the rounding of the spine. Yeah,
there's a great video from Mark Ripito as far as the simplicity of teaching the deadlift. And I really love the way he has people set up, which is basically get half of your foot under the bar. So as you look down, you can see half your foot in front, half behind. And then when you bend down to reach the bar, your shins will then contact the bar. There's some space as you stand up. If the foot is halfway under the bar, there's a little bit of space, like about not quite this much space here, but there's some space. But then as you bend and you flex the knees and the hips, your shins then come into contact with the bar. You're hopefully, arms are long enough at that point, you can reach the bar and kind of then establish that tight neutral spine position from which to pull. But we'll go ahead and we can see the bear down here. So
there's that too. So there's kind of like this use of movement to thinking that, hey, I'm going to, get a little momentum going here. In this particular application, not so good.
One of the things I notice here as he drops down, you notice the arms flex at the elbow, which is a great way to rip a bicep, by the way. If you're pulling a heavy weight, the arm needs to stay straight the whole time. As soon as you start bending and then pulling with all your strength into that, it's a recipe for a bicep tear.
Yeah.
But we noticed that he's flexed the knees a little bit more. I'd say besides the bar being out in front so much, this position here, and I want to cover up his the spine. But from the waist down or the hip down, not terrible, right? And then the first thing that comes up is
right. So notice the timing here, folks. The knees are extending and the hips haven't moved. The hips have elevated, but the hips haven't extended at all. The only thing that's moved is the knees. And so now his body is going forward and all the load is now on his spine. It's almost even out of his hamstrings, even though his hips are flexed, and he will have to eventually extend. All the extension is basically coming from the spine rather than the hips.
And you can see a very small shift anterior.
Yeah.
Right here, as he runs out of hip extension room, it's like, oh, I'm going to fall forward and turn this into a back. I mean, he's just lifting only with his back here, really. So obviously, the spinal mechanics are a huge concern, and part of that can be remedied by getting the bar a little closer to the shins, but primarily it's just you wanting to teach this guy how to properly find a neutral spine, get the hips a little bit lower, and approach from there.
And so what do we do? There's two questions. Number one, what do we do with that? And the simple answer is, hey, lighten the weight, right? Like, let's start with a lighter weight. So even if it is rounded, it's not as terrible. Because here's the deal: you lift stones or you lift odd objects. You look at tactical population. I love working with firefighters. They're stuck in terrible positions, and they're going to have to lift with a rounded back. But the idea is that if we're doing all of our reps in a controlled environment with good posture, the instances where we can't control for good posture, like a firefighter lifting someone in a small space, then we can have some freedom for less than ideal technique. But we've developed so much strength with good technique that the idea is we can survive that essentially.
Yeah.
But lessening the load on this, my question to you, Dr. H, is what do you do when a person you're working with is like, nah, I'm good, I don't want to lower the weight? That to me is like that's the toughest one.
I mean, what can you do? You can't force them to do that other than just say, hey, enjoy the spine problems, and then the next few years. But I've never personally run into that where you have someone with a heinous technique. I mean, here's the thing: like it depends on who you're working with. If let's say it's an athlete who's just stubborn enough to I want to get the number because it's a PR or whatever. I think there's value in trying to point them back to, hey, man, remember, this is not your sport. Your sport is not picking up the most weight off the floor possible. Your sport is whatever they're playing on the field. This is going to hurt you for sure in your pursuit of being better at your sport. Now, if they're in a competition setting, like let's say powerlifting, where their sport is deadlifting, hopefully they know a little bit better and they've listened to the people that have come before. There's a lot of that in powerlifting of kind of passing on knowledge and cues. And I really like that aspect of the strength sports in general. I think there's a lot of that kind of, teaching the next generation, what are the errors in technique, and you would hope that they would know better. But what would you say to that type of person?
Yeah, I've had that way too many times, and it's usually with things like a power clean, or especially when I was in we'll say a circuit training gym setting where it's going for speed and for time,
right.
And people don't care. It's like you teach technique for 30 minutes and then you have a 10-minute workout and they black out and forget all that stuff. So it's definitely on me as the individual, as the coach. It's on me. So I'll leave it there.
I mean, I think the more you can,
it's up to us,
you can build that culture in whatever gym setting you're in, where there's that, not letting people get away with faulty mechanics. I think you're doing yourself, you're helping yourself out there. So that's, there's only so many things you can do, but I think culture and the importance of not so that it's not just you as the coach, so that there are other people, whether it's their training partner or whoever it might be, who's also able to act as your second set of eyes, basically, and throw those same cues that you would be using towards your athletes. So there's, I think, a huge value. If you have let's say a sports team within a gym or any type of gym setting that you're in, really, where there's a community involvement, let's say, the more you can get that kind of culture built, I think you're going to be thankful for that. So anyway, I think the last thing I would note here is just one of the things you'll see here with this guy is just how much there's no room for knee extension to be taking place, because there's just not enough of it at the start of the lift here. He's obviously still got a lot of hip flexion because the spine is horizontal, so you can get some hip action taking place. But because he's basically completely eliminated the knee by having it almost fully extended at the start of the movement, it's all spine, and you get maybe some hamstring in there, but that's about it. Let's continue with some of the faulty mechanics here. This one it's a little fuzzy, but a great example of, again, faulty mechanics at the spine. But
let's talk setup real quick. So the start, we're decent. Still, the bar seems to be a little bit further away. It looks like he's starting to pitch himself forward and get his armpits past the bar. It's not a terrible setup. The feet look like they're kind of pointed out quite a bit. You can tell by seeing almost the backside of one ankle or the heel there. So, there's discussion about that and sumo stance and all that, but it's not that terrible. His neck isn't overly extended. I'd like to see it a little bit more neutral. But if I were to just see this snapshot, I'd be like, we can work with this. This isn't terrible, right? It's okay. What are you seeing here?
I would agree. Yeah, from this position here, again, cervical hyperextension and then the feet. Those are the two kind of glaring issues that I would want to correct. Getting the feet straight ahead, kind of better supporting the arch of the foot, and kind of trying to get the C-spine a little bit more neutral. But like I said, it's not terrible from right here.
But you can see that the bar is probably at the toenails rather than where the knots of your shoestrings are.
Yep.
And his knees are quite a bit forward. Again, it's a little hard to see, but you're starting to see potential faults. And these are what you want to see as the coach is how many things can I find before they even move? So you kind of can already anticipate what it's going to be.
Yeah. Now I want the viewer to watch. There is no change at the knee joint and the hip joint. And watch the first thing to move here. Watch the lumbar spine. Whoop.
Yeah.
So he goes from this, like we said, not a terrible position here to heinous right here.
Right.
And the first thing that moves, so Levi, when you're coaching athletes or anybody else in the deadlift, do you ever get into a discussion of what is the first thing to move, or do you give them any cues as far as head up or hips up or anything like that?
To be honest with you, I tend to watch people naturally. Like, what are they going to do before I even cue them through? Like, I try to keep things as simple as possible. So I just say stand up. Like, it's not hey, I want you to, start with your knees, but then extend your hips. I want you to just stand up from here. And then I kind of reverse engineer from there, for me personally.
I think for me, one of the things I've focused on a lot of times, if you tell people to drive the head up first, I mean, if we watch this guy here, the head almost like he kind of rounds the head down a little bit here. And this is driving up first. Whereas if you tell someone, same thing, if you tell them to stand up, the head is the first thing, like the body's going to follow the head. Whereas, just watching this is brutal. But
yeah.
Anyway.
But let's kind of slowly, so there you go, starts to pitch forward. So again, timing issue with the knee. The knees are extending before the hips. The hips haven't extended at all. And so essentially what's happening is instead of the hips extending with proper timing, the load's going to the back because the knees are way too quick to extend. Or maybe the knees aren't too quick to extend. It's just the hips aren't.
It's almost like if you were to look at the angle between the femur and the torso, it's almost like he's increased hip flexion here.
Correct.
And completely lost all knee flexion there. So same as the last guy. Essentially, like one interesting thing is the bar has actually moved closer now to his center of mass, which is important.
Yeah.
Like we talk about mechanical advantage, and because this is obviously a maximal weight for him, you have to there's no choice. You're not going to lift it if it's 3 inches in front of you. So the bar has moved in closer, which is where we'd want to see it to start with. So that's one of the errors, of course, and then just.
And folks, it's just not worth it. Just drop the weight. Like if you feel yourself, you'll feel yourself immediately. And if you're not aware of that, then if you don't have that level of kinesthetic awareness, then don't lift that much weight. Like you should, by the time you're lifting a max effort, particularly with a deadlift, even though I would argue it's safer than a squat from the standpoint of just being able to let go.
Less is more. Yeah.
So.
But I think it goes back again to the point of the importance of learning spinal mechanics and the kinesthetic kind of feel of that before you ever throw weight on a bar or before you put someone in that position. Even if they're a top level athlete, it's like you still need to learn how to stabilize your spine before you throw it under a load of any kind, whether it's maximal or not. Yeah. Anything else you want to discuss on this poor guy?
I think I'm all right.
Just don't do it. And again, I would just say, kind of reiterate, like, what does this benefit? There is no carryover of this to sport, to life, to anything other than the only benefit here is being able to say, hey, I lifted X amount of weight. That's it. There is no strength or power benefit or carryover to anything that we would want to see there. So anyway, enough with that one. This is a little bit more subtle, and I'm going to play this at regular speed and just kind of, we'll back it up, but I want to see if the viewer can see what's going on here. So I'm going to back this back up. So what isn't
too bad.
Yeah. So now again, it's a more subtle, like this person obviously has spent some time in the weight room and knows most of the way around the weight room pretty decently. So what are some of the things you see here, Professor G, Dr.
Yeah,
G?
the biggest thing for me is just that hitch forward. Like as soon as he goes, the knees go first before the hips. So from right here, I would, and all this person has to do is just start a little bit higher. Start with the hips. Start right there.
Yep.
Yep. If they started right there and started their pull, then I don't think they would have any of that tilting forward. So I don't know if it's easier to see actually with this one in slow mo or fast mode, but now that we're kind of sharing the chest kind of falling forward or the knees extending first before the hips, let's go in fast mode and see if people can now start to see that as well. And it's like you said, it's very subtle. If this was my lifter, I'm not, hey, you're terrible. And it's getting better, really. That one, timing a little bit still. I just feel like there's a lag in that hip extension. And this is the point of the lift. So for me, I think that this speaks to the importance of lessening the weight, but a violent hip extension during the contraction or the concentric contraction, and then controlling down on the eccentric. But or maybe even starting with some rack pulls or something like that, where the hips are higher and getting used to the timing of the knees and the hips.
Yeah, I think you mentioned the knees and the hips, kind of coordinating that. You notice on the way down, he gets a little bit of one of those issues that we talk about where the knees are flexing too soon a little bit on the way down. If you watch his eccentric here, you'll know you can't see the bar path very well from here, but it does shoot a little bit forward here, going around the knee.
And to be clear, this is very subtle, folks. When
Yeah.
we're talking about a reel, it's like the knees will bend first. At least he's simultaneously doing this teeter-totter that Ripeto's referring to, or like this kind of counterbalance of the knees and the hips. But usually it's knees all the way and then the hips get sent back.
Yeah, but I like that you kind of mentioned, like, here's where we want him to start. This is kind of the position where you want to start rather than starting with the hips too low.
Yep.
This is a really simple coaching change where it's just teaching a little bit of a higher hip and then trying to get from that position of kind of with the hips right here, then kind of getting the torso kind of pulling back a little bit so that you're getting the armpits back over the bar rather than pitching forward just a little bit. And like I said, this is a subtle one, but I think it's an important one because it's a common one where we get out over the toes. The center of mass or center of pressure of the body is in the toes, and the knees kind of get in the way here. Just a matter of cueing that person into a higher hip position to start.
Yeah.
This one, I think this is an interesting video to follow. This is Eric Lillibridge lifting 900 pounds at 23 years old, which is crazy. But we talk about a low hip, and so you'll see this individual has a pretty low hip right here. It's a squat position nearly. But one of the things we'll point out here is, when we get into powerlifting and different types of bars, obviously there are bars built for powerlifting that have a little bit more flex. And I kind of point the viewer's attention to the flex in the bar and where are the hips when the bar actually loses its flex. So yes, he is starting at a low hip position here, but notice the weight is still on the ground right here. And notice how much higher the hips are now as he begins to pull without pitching him forward. He's still got the armpits definitely back over the bar.
Ooh, a little bit there.
Yep.
So now the knees are starting to extend before the hips. Also keep in mind again, and everyone here this is a max effort for them more or less, except the video we just watched. So there's going to be some shifting and some mechanical things to probably point out, but
a 900-pound deadlift's never going to look perfect.
Well, the mountains looks pretty decent, and this one's not bad either. We see a little bit rounding of the shoulders here, but here's the other thing too is the difference between someone that lifts heavy and a professional power lifter. Like this person has been doing this for an extended period of time. And if you look at his back, if you ever look at pictures of his back, it looks like they put 2 slabs of meat, like just, it's nuts. So he's strong enough to support this exercise too, even though it's not a perfectly neutral spine. And this is a great example of that.
I think, yeah. So as you mentioned, like the idea of looking at elite powerlifters and kind of understanding that, hey, okay, this is their sport, and they are by nature, they've done thousands of reps of this movement, put on the strength and mass needed for some extra protection potentially, but they're also understandably maybe kind of playing a little bit with that line of, how close can I get to potentially hurting myself, but also adding weight to the bar. And they're dancing on that line. I'd say every time they step onto a
because for them it's worth it. Like,
yeah.
They're not going in it with, I'm going to do the worst technique possible. They want to keep technique, but when you're playing with 1,000 pounds, it's.
So this is a guy from Latvia, Konstantinovs. Unfortunately, he passed away a few years ago, but he's pretty well known, I'd say, for having a flexed thoracic spine. And you talk about a mechanical advantage there for that position is it allows us to get a higher hip position with the attachment still being on the bar. So if you don't have long arms, this is one way to effectively turn yourself into a long-armed lifter, is you round the thoracic spine. Notice that the lumbar spine is still very much in neutral. The thoracic spine has a little bit of natural kyphosis to it anatomically. So you can make some of an argument, I think, for getting away with a little bit of a flexed thoracic spine if you can keep a neutral lumbar spine, which he does. And again, there's putting you in a mechanically advantageous position to, there's some odd shifting going on there in the hips for sure. But this is a world record deadlift. So again, we can sit here from behind the computer screen and poke holes, but understand kind of what's going on here.
Yeah. But this was more so the example to show that you can have a bit of a rounded upper back or thoracic spine, but you want the lumbar neutral for sure. And Absolutely. Some of that rounding too is the shifting of the scapula, I think, around the thoracic spine or the thoracic region rather. So it's not even that the back is necessarily rounded. It's just that the scapulas aren't retracted and overly retracted. They're just kind of protracted slightly. But again, we're talking about someone that could probably bent row more than you squat. So,
sure. It's the same type of thing where you talk about like a retracted scapula for bench pressing versus a protracted. Look at how much longer my arm has now become. Same thing for the deadlift. We don't want this position because now you've got a short arm. Versus if you protract the scapula, your arms now become effectively longer, which mechanically advantageous position.
And I think one other thing that's important, and I kind of mad at myself that I didn't bring this up or this discussion, is the ability to bring tension to something, even though it's rounded. So in a lot of those novice lifters, you'll see that they may have a rounded spine, but they don't have the appropriate tension allocated to that position. A lot of people will round because they don't have the tension where it needs to be. This person may be so focused on their legs or whatever that they're not bringing the stability needed into the upper back. And I share this specifically with firefighters where they are in those instances where they have to have a rounded back. Even though you're rounded, you could still bring tension to that area. Yeah. And so that's an important thing to keep in your mind and understanding this kind of mind-muscle connection or this kinesthetic awareness is, even if you are a little bit rounded, bring all the tension to that area so it's at least stable. It's not going to move. It's not going to continue to round, essentially.
I think Lillibridge does a great job. You can see this as his kind of warm-up prep movements. You can see him pulling the tension out of the bar. And the same type of thing. Like if you watch this, he does this every time he deadlifts. He pull the tension, pull the tension, pull the tension, and then lift.
Yeah.
Whew. So it's the same type of thing where you learn to, or I guess you could say even with this guy here, it's learning to put tension into the lift at the right place where you have a higher hip. You then have to kind of manipulate a little bit, but it's learning how to put tension into that new position. I would say, I don't know how to describe that in a better way, but what you're saying is exactly right. Like,
and I'm not saying lift with a rounded back. I'll be clear there. I'm just saying that if there is some rounding, we can still be stable and supported there, particularly when we're lifting odd objects like stones, sandbags, so on and so forth, or you're a tactical athlete where you're in those positions.
Versus this guy who, when he drops down, you lose all tension as soon as he does that counter movement right there.
Yep.
You lose any of that tension that he should have had kind of in the spine, in the lats. That's a big one for sure. He's kind of locking down the lats and getting some of that extra strength to pull from that position.
Yep.
Here's our last one here. Hafthor Bjornsson, the mountain from Game of Thrones, just set. This was just this last week, I think.
Yeah.
He set a new world record for this is with straps. So he's lifting with straps here, but it's 1,100 pounds. So let's poke holes at. But I think one of the things, what are some of the things you wanted to point out with this one? Levi?
So number one, I mean, if you can get to the setup, let's get to the setup first. So right here, look how low he is, right? He's 6'8" and he's squatting lower than someone who's 5'8". Like he is down there. But when he goes to pull, he even starts in his squat. He's unique in that way. But now watch, his hips start to elevate first, and now he's going to get his timing with his knees and hips. So it's
same thing that you saw with Lillibridge, where the bars, the weight is still on the ground, but he's pulled the tension out of the bar. And yes, the hips start low, but they're automatically now up a few inches here before the weight has really begun to lift off the ground.
And I would even say, I'd throw out there that a lot of lifting it's kind of like baseball players where it's very routine. Like there's certain routines. You watch Olympic lifters who, stand up 3 times to get tension in their hips, or Eric Lillibridge does that 3 times. Yep. There's a lot of routine to that. And so that could just be his routine, getting down into the squat first. And then, but he knows once, it's like a baseball player. Some baseball players start with the bat on their shoulder, but every baseball player, once the pitch starts to come in, they all get into this same position. And so don't get fooled by the first 3 seconds. Look when the weight actually starts to move. Any good lifter will be in just about the same position, assuming anatomy is relatively the same.
Right. Yeah, that's a great point. I like that. The kind of, when you look at the dynamic aspect of the lift, there's a lot of similarities. Yeah.
So go full speed with him too right now, so they can see. Yep. So he kind of like squats and lets it roll into him. And as soon as the bar rolls into him, he knows it's time to raise my hips up and drive. That's what it seems like for his routine here.
Yep. I would agree. Yeah. So hopefully those are some good examples to show you guys errors as well as some of the good things to be looking for in a deadlift. What would you like? Anything else we need to add as far as recapping?
I would say the only other thing that popped into my mind was frequency. How often should we deadlift? And this is
when we talk about life cycle and loading and things like that.
Yeah. So, I mean, we don't basically start with less weight. For me, I like to start with someone from the top down. So from this top position and have them eccentrically descend, and then, or start from blocks or something like that. Get someone as far as life cycle goes, get someone in a mechanically comfortable and advantageous position and like progress them that way. You don't have to start from the floor, so feel free to start a little bit higher if that's a better position for them as they work on their mobility and flexibility through their warm-ups. But one thing for me is frequency, and that will perhaps change with, of course, the sport. Like for me, general population, if you deadlift once a week, that's good for me. Like it's pretty taxing on the nervous system. Like it's a posterior dominant movement that's like you're firing all of it. So it's neuromuscular, it's taxing in that way. And so for me, once a week, maybe volume of 15 to 30 reps or so. I tend to find myself training the posterior chain, the volume in the accessory work, not the deadlift, because it's typically reserved for a heavy load. Rather than do 50 reps of just the bar, you can do some other stuff. And in fact, maybe that's even better, doing single leg RDLs or single leg exercises to train the posterior for working on stability and coordination.
Banded RDLs, baby.
Yeah, exactly. But
that's why I love those, man. You get such a good pump in the low back doing those.
Yeah.
Hamstrings, glutes, and low back you just be lit up after. And those, I would be doing those for higher reps. But
yeah.
One of the things you mentioned when you talk about like warming up, one of my pet peeves that I just can't stand seeing is when people start with the bar, so there's no weight on the bar, and they're picking up the bar off the ground. Like, oh, this is I'm doing my warm-up sets, and they like, that is not even close to, there's no way you can pick up a bar off the ground with perfect form.
Yeah.
So like for me, like if you're going to start with the bar, which is fine, put it on some racks or put it on something so that it's starting at least chin level.
Yeah.
Not picking it up straight off the ground. Because I mean, you talk about like starting someone from the beginning stages of a deadlift. If you're giving them the bar and it's starting on the ground, you're saying, okay, we're going to work on the deadlift. I guarantee you they're not going to have a neutral spine and the proper lifting mechanics from that point. So that's one of the ones I would add there as far as the life cycle of the beginner doing the deadlift with just bar, make sure it's at the right height. If anything, air too high up. And when we talk about like reps and sets and volume, I would say anytime you're loading the spine, be very, very careful with, I would definitely err on the side of less volume rather than more. You don't want to be doing this in a fatigued state where it's easy to lose the proper mechanics and default into, you know, one of these types of positions that we see. So be careful with too much volume or doing too much so that you're in a fatigued state when you're pulling. So when you're actually doing the deadlift, like you said, I would agree once a week is plenty. And then as we age, even, I know for me, like it's not something, I don't want to be doing 1 rep maxes of deadlifts a whole lot. Just because of recovery from the central nervous system and you know,
and it is a slow, painful lift. Like I would focus more on speed, a little bit lower weight, and focus on speed. And this is also, that also is relative to people that are for Olympic lifting. You don't need someone that's 40 years old and doesn't have training experience Olympic lifting right away. Maybe you progress them to that and that's fine, but this is a great exercise, again, to train the posterior chain. We can still achieve the violent hip extension loaded, but don't have to do the clean. So this is a great alternative to that, but still training a similar movement pattern.
So can you talk about that real quick as far as using different tempos or different speeds of when you're executing the deadlift? Like you said, when we think of the deadlift, we think of a 1 rep max, a very slow kind of grinding lift, which is great for building maximal strength, not great for building speed necessarily, unless you're lacking maximal strength. There's a component of speed and strength that needs to be kind of put together for power to result. So if you're weak, building maximal strength may be the key to the equation that you need. Once you've built a moderate or serviceable level of strength, though, what do you think about as far as the idea of throwing in some speed deadlifts or some working on just that violent hip extension under speed without a maximal load?
Yeah, I think for me, training speed is more important than training strength. But let me try to refine that, because that sounds basically that strength doesn't transfer to speed like speed transfers to strength, in my experience. So like, you know, if you lift slow, you may be strong, but that's not going to make you faster. If everything you do is slow and grindy and heavy, that doesn't translate to speed. Whereas if you can move lighter loads faster, it does translate to strength. And we see that a lot if you look at Prelipin's chart with powered specific movements, the weight's at 60%. Like, that's light, but you're using that speed as a conduit to developing strength. Now you need to do both. Like, you can't just move fast and never overload. But for me, I would rather focus on people developing speed than just absolute strength, if I were to pick one or the other, because I feel like speed gives you speed, of course, but it can also translate to strength when needed.
I mean, when you think of like how many movements in life or sport are really slow, grindy movements where it doesn't happen often unless you're doing what you're doing out, you know, building a retaining wall with a bunch of rocks.
Right. But even that, I mean, like, there's I don't even want to be slow and grindy with that, because I got to throw them too.
Right. Yeah.
Throw them out the truck. So I need a little bit of violence in my hip extension speed. So
yeah. So I mean, for me, at least at this point in my life, you know, as I'm getting closer to 40, and things ache for no reason, or for 20 years ago, reasons that happened 20 years ago type of thing. The idea of kind of minimizing those really slow, heavy, grindy lifts and focusing more on movement quality for sure, but incorporating more volume kind of in whether it's an accessory movement, you know, like a banded RDL or something, one of those things I enjoy where you're still targeting the same muscular patterns and the same muscles for sure, but doing it in a lower intensity, but what am I trying to say? You know what I'm saying? As far as just like the life cycle of the lift is going to change a little bit unless you're competing in this sport. I think there's probably more application for the athlete and the general population of allowing yourself maybe we just target a 5 rep max instead of a 1 rep max on our heavy day.
And that's with almost any lift for me, really. Like, there's no reason to get, unless you want to test yourself, there's not much reason to get less than 5%, or excuse me, a 5 rep max.
Yeah.
Maybe a 3, But
Yeah, I
that
agree.
kind of
Yeah,
3 to 5 rep range is still in the 90% theoretically of your 1 rep max. So you're still overloading. You're
yeah,
still like being able to lift. To me, it's more impressive to lift heavy weight a couple times than just once.
yeah.
It's all impressive and so on and so on. But the ability to repeat the strength to me or the speed is also equally impressive. So
Mhm.
yeah,
Yeah,
that's
I think, yeah, my last note would just be, I think there's more application. You see more application in the ability to do a couple repetitive motions, or even just kind of building a little bit of additional speed into the movement. I think can be helpful.
mhm. Yeah.
Anything else you want to add?
No, I think that's it. I mean, there's certainly further discussion for this one. We didn't really get into frequency and volume and all that stuff, and perhaps that's for another day, or maybe we talk about that in general in a programming video or something like that. But don't be scared of the deadlift. You know, you hear all the time, lift with your legs, not with your back. But I always joke and say, you need your back for this lift. Like, you need to be
Absolutely.
very aware of what's happening in your backside, not just the hamstrings and glutes, but your spine in that region as well. So it is a back exercise. There's so you lift with your back, like, but we don't want it to be the only, as we've seen in the previous videos with all the rounding. We don't want that. So
Yeah, don't lift your back like this poor guy,
yeah,
or this poor guy.
yeah.
But there's certainly, uh, this example was pretty good as far as lifting with your back, I'd say.
Mm-hmm.
But like I said, it's not just the back. It's, yes, the back is involved. It's a posterior chain. So yes, we're getting a ton of. Well, that's one of the things maybe we want to touch on last year. One of the huge values of the deadlift is it recruits a ton of musculature.
Mm-hmm.
You talk about like building entire body strength. We start from the shoulders down to the ankles. Like everything involved there is, I mean, everything from the shoulder to the ankle is working at maximal,
Mm-hmm.
um, you know, power output basically
Yeah,
to
everything
get that
being
bar on the ground.
recruited.
Yeah,
Yeah.
so there's a lot of musculature involved there that, certainly the lats, the erector spinae, the glutes, the hamstrings, the quads,
Mm-hmm.
all of that is being challenged at a great degree. And like we said in the beginning, we all lift things off the ground every single day. So it's important to be able to practice it, to be able to understand how to do it correctly, how to sequence everything, how to understand the mechanics of proper lifting. Even if you're not trying to set a world record or lifting a 1 rep max ever, that's okay.
Mm-hmm.
It's still an important movement pattern, I would say, to be working in.
Mm-hmm. Awesome.
Well, that's all I got. Thank you guys for listening. Thanks, Dr. Garrett, for your thoughts and for your experience here chiming in. And hopefully this is of benefit and of value for the listener.
Thank you all as well. See you soon.